All right, everybody. Hi, I'm Ryan Esquivel, so I'm the developer and director for Project Cyclops. This is an Oculus Rift project. So if no one knows exactly what the Oculus Rift is, it's essentially this little device or doohickey thing on the right-hand side there. It's essentially a pair of goggles that's able to replicate, to make virtual reality. They are VR headsets by definition. So VR headsets, their interpretation is that basically a system that's able to generate a fictional or any sort of engine, like a narrative or pretty much anything you want. Anything that was assembled inside computers can then be viewed in full stereoscopic view. So the secret to how this works is actually really no secret. It's really the same concept as if if you were wearing 3D glasses at like a theater pretty much. So you have a left image, a right image, and they make a 3D composite there in the center. So it's pretty much the same exact reason they work. Now, the really interesting thing about the Oculus Rift is really its a way of being able to get a person to lose their sense of reality, to lose basically their footing. So if you can tell by the really, really interesting dance this guy's doing, he doesn't really have any perception of where he is. He's essentially either falling or riding a roller coaster or riding a hippo. I have no entire clue what he's doing, but that is his own world. That's his own interpretation of what he thinks is going on in that reality, and everyone just sort of gets to sit there and laugh at him the entire time. And virtual reality isn't always just used for just the pictures of either falling or even just reality. It can also just be used for fairly abstract purposes like this, which is essentially the Pokemon game that got turned into an Oculus Rift game. So sometimes it's really just cartoons and not really anything special. So this is a very small interpretation of how the Oculus Rift sort of works. So this is basically something like a television or of that sort. However, the Oculus Rift's field of view is far greater than that, and the reason for that is that it does cover your peripherals when you are looking through these goggles. So you're able to see things at the corner of your eye, that kind of stuff. It's immensely useful for things like horror demos and stuff like that. And the concept for virtual reality, surprisingly, actually isn't very new. It's actually been around for quite some time and in other forms such as augmented reality, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So you can also argue that maybe the basic stereoscope that existed probably in like the 1800s is probably your first real definition of a stereoscopic or virtual reality headset, even though it didn't really move or anything. It was usually just one image. And then they went off into other things, such as military hardware. Essentially, this was used for some sort of parachuting HUD display, essentially. And they started getting a little bit more fancier, and then they had entire huge displays. And this very peculiar one over here called the Sensorama is a very old virtual reality kind of simulation that actually was able to simulate things like air and smell, actually. So this is probably one of the first machines that ever really did something like that, and it was actually fairly intriguing. And if you look at here, there's actually a full lineup of stuff in augmented reality and virtual reality headsets that have been developed for quite some time now. And this thing here on the right, of course, the Virtual Boy, probably the reference that everyone here today probably still understands, that failed attempt by Nintendo at virtual reality when it was still pretty young in the market. So what I really want to talk about specifically really is virtual reality and what it is right now and what it's actually turning into. So particularly when I started this project at the beginning of the semester, it was kind of more academic. It was more about what can virtual reality do, how can it affect people and that kind of stuff. But then news started changing everything. Suddenly, Oculus Rift and a lot of virtual reality actually started taking center stage. Everyone was interested in it. Everyone wanted a piece of the puzzle. And that's essentially what's happening right now, is it's becoming immensely popular, and it's going to be something incredibly big very, very soon. So this is already the Oculus Rift Development Kit 2. So the Oculus Rift Development Kit 2 is actually already at 1080p, a much higher resolution, and it has some other quirky things now, such as positional tracking. So this is now on top of actually having that gyroscope inside the headset. You're actually able to move in all different directions, from left, right, and up and down, and that's being accomplished by that very tiny camera that you saw on the very last slide. So when you look over here, this is also another quirk that they're also working on, which is called a low persistence OLED display. And this is a very peculiar technology from what I can understand, because it essentially blurs out frames in between the show in order to decrease nausea. So I don't entirely understand how this functions, and I've never actually seen it in action, but I'm very, very curious as to how this will change the field. Now, The reason why I sort of changed my research topic is essentially because of this. Now, who exactly knows what this means? Just by a show of hands. A few people do. So basically, very, very recently, Facebook, you know, that guy, bought Oculus VR, the company that makes this headset, for a whopping $2 billion. So I think it was like 400 million in stock, and I think about, I don't know, it was 16 million in stock, and then after that it was 400 million, I believe. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it means a couple of different things. And Facebook is a huge entity. They don't go around and just scoop something up because they think it's pointless or something that's going to become a gimmick. And VR technology actually never had a consumer release up until this point. Even the virtual reality headset that I still have is still a developer kit. It never had a consumer release, even till this date. So what does that mean when Facebook goes and buys an experimental technology that never even had prime time? It's never even been proven. What do they know? Well, Mark Zuckerberg, at least in his own words, already sees potential in this. And he says here in a quote, and I'll read it to you. After games, we're going to make Oculus a platform for many other experiences. Imagine enjoying a courtside seat at a game, studying in a classroom of students and teachers all over the world, or consulting with a doctor face-to-face just by putting on goggles in your home. Now, he's a bit sensationalist in this ideal, but essentially what he's trying to do, or what the world is essentially moving to, is putting VR in more places than just video gaming. It'll have places in education, have places in healthcare. So the questions that can be asked about this are huge. I mean, where can you put this? And I actually had to think about this with a lot of my other colleagues and stuff like creating driving simulators, stuff to educate people on how to shoulder check and stuff like that, because you can actually do stuff like that within the Oculus Rift, and I can definitely see it happening in the future. Another thing that Mark also said as well is this is really a new communication platform. By feeling truly present, you can share unbounded spaces and experiences with the people in your life. Imagine sharing not just moments with your friends online, but entire experiences and adventures. Still another sensationalist claim, but what is he also really talking about? He's talking about basically virtual reality being a virtual space and something that is even sociable. Perhaps you might even see yourself putting on a pair of goggles to go to a nightclub, talk to someone completely on the other side of the world in a reality that doesn't exist. Basically turning space into anything that you want. Now here's where I get to talk about augmented reality. Now, augmented reality differs slightly from virtual reality, mostly in the case that it is your own room. He's essentially attached a camera to the front of his virtual reality device and is now projecting 3D images into the real world. As in such, this TV is not actually there. It's actually only in virtual reality, and only he can see it. All that's really in the room is really just this plain wall, and he's projecting that information here. So again, in the words of Mark, virtual reality was once the dream of science fiction, but the internet was also once a dream, and so were computers and smartphones. The future is coming, and we have a chance to build it together. Again, what does he imply by this? That virtual reality is indeed a thing. It's going to become a thing, and I believe even as a new media major and as anyone else in any other field, they're going to touch upon this technology at one point or another, and very, very soon. The Developer Kit 2 was slated to come out in July, and probably there's going to be a consumer release very soon after that. At least that's what I can predict anyway. So this goes into what my project was. Now, my project actually went through a couple of different evolutions throughout its time. And it first started off when I was researching about dreams and virtual reality and how that actually affected how you interpreted storylines inside VR. So a lot of those aspects are actually still within the demo. Essentially, that the demo is in it's in sort of a movie-like format where it's depicted with a lot of camera movements, establishing shots and voice acting as well in order to establish a narrative. And that's where the process for this essentially came from. Now, the way that I judged how it was going to work essentially was in terms of interactivity and how you perceive realism. Now, movies are very, very interesting mediums, but they're not very interactive. You sit down in a seat, you just look at the 2D screen, and you just absorb information. Video games actually have a lot of narrative and a lot of story to them as well. Very, very engaging stories, but they have a high degree of interactivity in which the occupant needs to know how to use a controller, which isn't very friendly to every single person. Not everyone knows how to use controllers, so this actually adds a bit of a complication. My project actually stands within the pure middle of that, because simply of the whole virtue that all you have to do is turn your head in order to experience the media and nothing else. In terms of realism, movies are very high up there, as well as video games, because of that interactive element. But because of the mixture of between those two different elements, I almost slate my project as being a little bit more real than the two of them put together. The reason being is because you're immersed in the environment, you can still look around in it, but you're not controlling it so far that it's deterrative of that experience. So here we go into actually the development of my process and exactly how it went from start to finish. This is a very, very early developmental model where I was trying to basically understand how Unity functioned. Actually, one of the things about this assignment is that I never worked with video games before. I never worked with a 3D engine or with an engine of this kind and was completely lost. I actually came from a background of doing 3D asset design, and that's really all I did. This project ended up becoming something incredibly multidisciplinary, doing all of these different fields such as sound design, cinematography, basic design, anything that you really thought of in new media was actually applied into this, and I never thought that any of those skills would have ever been used, but there they came. So the typical workflow, and this is actually starting off with my background of simply being a 3D modeler, is any of the 3D models in my actual demo are usually started off as sketches within Sketchbook Pro. They're then taken into 3ds Max and actually created into a mesh. It's sometimes also changed a little bit depending on how I wanted that model to feel, and then ended off with being painted off in ZBrush and actually giving it that look and appeal that it definitely deserves. Now, the actual method to how this works is that the assets are designed with all of these three different programs, and then they're also all put into the Unity 3D game engine, which is then ported over to Oculus VR. If you're not entirely sure what Unity is that it's a game engine that basically is meant for exactly what you think it is. It's meant actually for video games. And it looks very much like this. It's just sort of an interface that you're able to place objects, give them purposes, and write a bunch of code in order to make them to do things. And as you can see from the example here on the side, this is a bunch of AI, essentially, that are programmed in order to just fight each other to make a cinematic scene, in this sense. And they'll do a lot of funky things. There's a lot of troubleshooting when it comes to them just sort of ramming into things and doing very, very funky things that you probably wouldn't want them to do. But that's what the fun, really, of playing with this kind of stuff, where it actually comes from, is that it's very, very enjoyable to just put a line of code in or just modify one command and just see what happens. And that was one of the driving forces behind this project, was really just experimentation. One of the really big caveats for me is that I am not much of a programmer. I'm not a real dedicated programmer. I can't read code very well. So in order to offset this, I actually was able to invest in a certain kind of plugin that actually made things, at least to me in English, into a more modular interface that made a lot more sense to me. Now, in the demo, if you ever do get a chance to play it, you're going to actually see a lot of living characters on the actual docking bay. And these are actually all motion captured at the University of Lethbridge's mocap studio, which I had about 2 different motion capture people actually doing actions for me over here, as shown here. And that's all of their movement here is all just being completely imported into those different models. And it's a very, very lengthy process. The mocap studio there at the university is actually sort of on its last legs. It kind of lost 2 functioning cameras since the time I've been working with it. So getting clean data that wasn't really corrupted was sort of a challenge there, and it took several hours even to get the system running, essentially restarting the thing over and over again. Now I'm just going to go and explain through the several stages that this project went through, sort of from start to finish. And the first week was really just planning. A lot of the, first of all, it was writing that narrative script, actually understanding what do I want the characters to say, what to do. The storyline actually ended up being very, very general, and the reason I made it general is so that the experience was adaptable to anyone that used the program. They could relate to it, so it wasn't meant to have any sort of uniqueness to it. It was made that way on intention. And then a bunch of technical tutorials, because all I was, before this project started, was a 3D asset designer. Everything from heading over to Edmonton and learning about Unity from Microsoft, actually, which was a very, very useful event. And also the optimization of any past models that I had designed prior to this project. In theory, if you really look at it, I've actually been technically working on this project even before this semester started. All of the models that you see there were actually models I had worked on even before that. I was just playing with 3ds Max and designed something interesting, and they made it into this demo as well. Of course, they weren't optimized specifically for game engines, so I actually did that optimization myself throughout this time period. And of course, there's the production period where we were building the actual framework in Unity, and this involved a lot of understanding code, understanding how mechanism functions, and all this kind of stuff. And it's a very, very large scope of stuff that needs to be covered, and it's not something that I can really talk about in great depth. And of course, making that first beta build in voice recording. So voice recording and sound design. Sound design, most of the music is actually royalty-free stuff that I had gotten from ages ago, actually, that I was able to implement. I'm not a sound designer by any stretch of the imagination. However, voice recording, I was actually helped by two specific people. First one who actually plays the pilot of my demo, which is Court Davies, and the other one is Amanda Bigford, who you've actually already met at the beginning of this day. She's actually right here. And of course, the motion capture and animation that I also went through a little bit earlier. The second beta build came after that, and also the theoretical research and asset development basically was ongoing throughout the entire process. If I needed a new asset that needed to roll out, I just rolled it right in. So in post-production, we worked on beta testing, which is really basically almost the now stage, is really just testing the demo, seeing what people's responses are, finalizing those text grid models, actually optimizing the entire demo for use on computers. And going to Edmonton for the Microsoft conference was actually very helpful in this regard. They taught me a lot about how to optimize models for mobile, actually, which are very, very limited when it comes to GPU specs. So that was very crucial in getting this demo to run smoothly in almost every computer, but I still had to use my own in the end in order to get the thing to run. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and show a very, very small clip. It's actually just a trailer of my demo here. And it'll sort of, it's not Oculus compatible, but it's just to whet your appetite to actually go ahead and see the demo. It's just right across this wall. And here we go.
Is it fun?
Hold on your stomach.
All right, so that actually marks the end of my presentation there. Special thanks again to my two voice actors here, Amanda Bigford, who actually did both my protagonist and the ship AI computer, And the pilot, who was Court Davies, and the motion capture talents, Lynn and Alex, were the ones motion capturing most of my stuff. So there is my email address if you'd like to get in contact with me. If you have any questions about how Oculus works or if any question about the development of this process, feel free to email me. And there's my website as well, where you can actually go ahead and look at the entire process from start to finish via the blog entries that I've made and also the models that I've created specifically for the demo itself. Any questions, anybody?
Continue this project? Like, are you going to expand on this project? Or
I definitely want to, actually. It's because of all the skills I learned doing this initial project, because it was my first game development project, I definitely think, and I'm just rearing to go for a second project because I know exactly where all my mistakes were, and I know exactly how to make the next experience even better.
So are you going to make another demo, or are you thinking like?
I kind of think I might go for another demo just to sort of test out some more theories and then maybe move on to another full production.
Do you want to stay in the kind of space environment, or do you want to?
I actually kind of want to experiment with other ones. The one reason I picked a space environment really is because, one, it's kind of easy, science fiction is very tricky because you can sort of make up a lot of things that it can still end up being true. And you can sort of make up a lot of things with space. And you can get away with a lot of mistakes, really, which are in there as well, as in planes flying the wrong direction. Hey, that can happen in space, maybe, I'm not sure. But I definitely want to experiment with things like horror and stuff like that. Horror demos are very, very well done in the Oculus Rift and can really really, really scare you very well. That's actually one of my next topics is a horror demo. Hey, well.
First of all, just let me comment that in watching the audience last night, they found your technology very sexy.
Yes, that's right.
About your next demo, you might even consider merging something that has some kind of cultural or educational component just in order to position yourself. And I'm just tossing this out. You might consider a Mayan temple as the setting for your horror.
Oh yeah, of course, definitely. That could be scary.
Now, bearing in mind that Mark has purchased this for Facebook, and there is the anticipation that this is going to explode, it seems to me that you're positioning yourself very well in two ways. Number one, to provide content, and the second thing is to be a skill provider in order to fulfill the demand of people having capital, wanting to get stuff for the public.
Right.
Now, if you do this, are you going to be like selling your work as like a video game? Will there be a way that you can capitalize?
There definitely is, actually. I do know of some developers who are working with the Oculus that do actually sell some of their work. This one in particular, I don't know yet. I'd have to fix it up before I'm actually comfortable with it being sold as something like that. But yeah, it's definitely possible. There's definitely a market for that already.
So in 2 years, what do you see yourself? How do you see yourself?
I'm actually not too sure. Like, I really wanted to work specifically with virtual reality and stay within that realm. Because I think originally when I went into university, I was more of a game developer, actually, and that was more for 2D content. But game development is such a hard thing to get into now, and it's very, very competitive, that getting into virtual reality is almost like it's like new soil, basically. So it's a very, very good place to grow, and I think by making more demos like this, making it more well-known, I can basically become a content provider, and that's what I think I'm going to be, is just a content provider for Oculus for things like architecture or driving and that kind of stuff.
We want you to come back in a couple of years and be a guest here.
Okay, I'll take that invitation, though. Hey, Dina.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk. I wonder if you can speak a bit about, you had that quote from Zuckerberg, I think it was the second one, and one of the lines was that this puts us all in the present, right?
Right.
I can't remember the fuller quote, but could you maybe just talk a wee bit about the paradox of that? Because it's obviously, we're not really in the present right?
Let's try to get this quote up so I can actually read it. I read stuff and then just kind of like gloss over it sometimes. So you're talking about the second quote?
Yeah, I think it was the second one.
This one?
By being truly present, right? But
yeah.
it's a completely different kind of present.
It's a very, very different kind of present, yeah. I'm not too sure exactly what he's really referring to with that. I think when he talks about Facebook, I think being in the present is in being in the now, I guess, in like online life, I suppose, is what I think he means, because I'm not too sure. By feeling truly present, you can share unbounded experience. But I think what he means is being present in the experience is what he's talking about more likely. And I don't know, like, about a paradox, I suppose?
Well, I guess just because if you're present, but you're present in a virtual world, right?
Right. You're not. Yeah, because they aren't really. Oh, yes, that's right. So yeah, that's definitely a strange thing, because when it comes, and that's only really versed in like stuff like online interaction and stuff like that. And the Oculus Rift up until now actually hasn't been used for that purpose. There's actually very few experiences that actually include other people being in the demos, and that's. Yeah, it's definitely a new thing that's going to become kind of like a weird problem, because you can, it's like the whole problem with World of Warcraft when you talk around people. It's like, are you really a man or a woman, or are you really the person you say you are? It's a whole different kind of, are you really who you are? Because you can fake who you are. It's this huge bit of an anonymity. So I think, yeah, it's definitely going to be a different experience for most of that.
Do you see that as retarding, or just sort of exacerbating and expanding what already exists?
I think it's going to exasperate what already exists now, because the internet blew up originally basically for that purpose, for social notes. Everyone wanted to talk to each other, and that's why Twitter and stuff and Facebook are so popular. And even with all the negatives of that, stuff like stalkers and stuff like that, it's not going to matter, because it's going to blow up in popularity regardless of all of those negative facts. That's what I think anyway.
Thank you.